Yeah. Okay, so the ones in red here have something to do with ELT. To be an effective English language teacher, you'll need to know, of course, all the pedagogy side. You need to have some idea of the acquisition side. That is, you'll need to know, how the brain works in terms of memory and retention. You'll have to have some idea of what schema are and how that affects how we design materials and so on. And on the left, of course, you need to understand grammar. You need to know what the rules of grammar are. You need to have probably some idea of phonology, be able to explain the difference between dialects when students ask you. Of course, you need a very good understanding of vocabulary about which words are important and not important. And the other things here, semantics, you need to understand something about meaning, how meaning is made, how we display that meaning pragmatically through various text types and discourse, and hopefully some other aspects of, because we have a very diverse population, gender and language, language and power, these are all going to be important at some point, possibly the advanced levels. The ones in purple you may have to deal with. Comparative linguistics, for example, maybe you need to compare Thai and English. You may need to compare older English versus modern English. You may need to compare British versus, say, Australian English. And of course, translation. Some of you, many of you, will have translation as part of your language teaching. So all of these things here are some of the areas we need to have a look at. It's a very, very broad area. So how do we sort of bring ELT into this and get some kind of an idea about where we are and what we're going, how we are proceeding? So, I'll just move my mouse. There we go. So, as you're all aware, this is all stuff that you already know. I'm not going to go through this in detail. Please don't read every single word. This is spelling mistake right at the top. So, you're all aware of these various methods: grammar translation, direct method, audiolingual, communicative language teaching. These are some methods and approaches which have emerged over time to help us, to guide us in teaching. These are not the only ones. There's some other ones: lexical approach, CBI, CLIL, blended learning, project-based learning, and a whole host of others. All of these things here have been put forward as ways to approach language teaching for various different backgrounds and for various different needs. And it's great that we have all of these various methods. So I'll come back to this a little bit later. So the other thing we need to look at is in terms of the way we structure our language teaching, either as course directors or individual teachers or curriculum designers or materials writers or just your ordinary teacher at the chalk face, we'll need to understand some of the core principles, some of the core ideas behind ELT. And here's just a few of them. These are all very famous pieces of research, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with or have heard about at some point. I'm not going to go through them. But you can see that Vygotsky, for example, told us about the zone of proximal development, I+1, something that Stephen Krashen has taken on. Canali and Swain put forward the theoretical basis of CLT, communicative language teaching. Anderson, very interestingly, found out that declarative knowledge can become procedural. I'm hoping that you understand the difference between declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge. Declarative knowledge is knowledge of something, like the name of something, how to translate a particular word. Procedural knowledge is where you can actually use it in process. Comprehensible input, I'm sure you're all familiar with Stephen Krashen. He said that was really important. Michael Long said that we actually learn through interacting. We can't just learn from input. We need to actually interact. We need to actually co-create language with other people. Swain added to that comprehensible output. Devassin and Veronis took on the work of Michael Long and talked about we need to negotiate meaning. This is co-created texts. Sweller looked at we need to take the benefits of human cognition, the aspects of human cognition in terms of memory and memory structures, bring them into the learning. Alan Badley then did a lot of work on memory research And Schmidt took that on to show that noticing and paying attention to various things is critically important when we are looking at language learning. And Norris and Ortega looked and very importantly found that explicit instruction can lead to implicit acquisition. Paul Nation, I'm sure you've heard of, has talked about the 4 strands, which is a structure for organizing our classes, and Nation and Newton have looked at fluency development. So these are just some of the aspects of foreign language, and they're all sort of principles, they're all sort of research and ideas that we bring forward. So out of these theories and out of the methods that we looked at previously, there are some aspects of foreign language learning which I would say are probably well accepted by your average person, your average teacher. You may not agree with all of them, and some of them may be a little bit fuzzy here and there, and I've probably missed a few as well. But here are some of the things that I think most of us could generally agree on. The first thing is we need to make sure we focus on the forms. We need some language-focused learning. The students need to learn the grammar and vocabulary. That's obvious. We need to make sure that the development of the language that we teach is scaffolded. We have to build on previous learning. We can't adopt a random approach. We can't just go scattergun picking anything that we wish. We have to scaffold that development. We also need to control language complexity. That means we need to teach the easy stuff first, the stuff that's easy to pick up, the stuff which is really important should come first. So we go from the easy to the complex. We need to make sure that we recycle, repeat, and practice whatever it is that we teach. That's an obvious thing to do. We also know that massive amounts of input and exposure are going to be needed. We need to have, as well as language-focused learning, we need to have meaning-focused learning. We need to have students actually speaking, actually reading, writing, and so on, rather than just completing gap-fill exercises or control production activities. Therefore, the activities that students do have to be meaningful interactions, not just an interaction to complete an exercise. They have to be meaningful to the student. They have to feel some kind of connection to the work that they're doing, and make sure that the activities they're doing are meaningful. We also need to teach the most useful language forms first before we teach the less useful. So we teach the most common grammatical forms. For example, the past tense and the present tense make up about 90% of verb uses in English. They're clearly more important than, say, present perfect continuous. So high-frequency words are going to be more useful than less frequent words. And frequent forms should be taught before rare words. That's obvious as well. Let's deal with the words that students need first, ones they're going to meet first, and then later deal with the rarer words and the rarer grammar. Students need to develop fluency. They need to be able to not just read something with a dictionary. They need to know how to read something or speak or write fluently. We'll come back to talk about this later. We need to make sure that they have enhanced comprehension of stuff. We don't just want literal comprehension. We want to make sure they're able to understand things at the inferential level and various other levels of comprehension. We need to make sure we respect diverse viewpoints. We have to include people from various cultures, various the genders, of course, is going to be important, sexual viewpoints, all of these things. We have to be aware that these may have an impact on our classes. We have to accept people from various backgrounds and don't just model our language on one type of English, whether that be only US or only British. We need to have world Englishes might be included in this. We need to make sure there's a transfer between the skills, that the reading becomes writing or speaking, for example, or that the writing would then lead on to maybe some form of presentation. So we need to have transfer between skills rather than just teach each of the skills independently. We need to respect individual differences in learning styles, individual differences in so many different ways, which you're all familiar with. We need to make sure the material is cognitively engaging. They need to actually be able to think and hopefully develop their critical thinking skills, their emotional intelligence. We don't just want perfunctory sort of activities. We want to have cognitively engaging and emotionally engaging material. Therefore, the material and things that we do in class, as much as we can, we need to try to reflect real-life relevance. And we need to embrace all kinds of socio-cultural contexts. Importantly, a lot of the work that we do should be focused on the learner. What does the learner need rather than what does the teacher want to teach? We have to focus on learner needs. And autonomy is right at the top of the list there. We have to make sure that students are independent learners. And what we're teaching has to be achievable. We don't want to have stuff which is very, very difficult for the students. And if it's achievable and students feel they're making gains, they will therefore have intrinsic motivation. So these are just some aspects of foreign language learning, which I think most of us could probably agree with. There may be a few that I've missed, but generally speaking, in the perfect world, we would have classes that would be able to do these things. So one of the questions I often get asked is the very naive question, what's the best method of teaching English? Well, of course, this is a terrible question. There is no one method, we all know this. And a simple thought will tell you that, of course, it depends on who you're teaching, what you're teaching. It really makes a huge difference. What is important is to make sure that teachers and students understand the important principles of teaching and learning. This is critical. Because if you understand some of the core principles of language learning and teaching, you'll be able to then direct your class based around those principles, rather than just grab whatever comes in the textbook. You'll be able to look at the textbook and sort of say, oh, well, the textbook's not doing this, or the textbook's doing too much of that, I need to supplement. And being able to choose a textbook that follows the principles that you need for your particular class. So a range of approaches is better. Now, when we look back at those approaches that we looked at before, the grammar translation, direct method, audiolingual, and so on, we all are familiar with these are relatively limited. What many of these things do not do is they don't really approach many of those things. There's an approach by a man called Kamara Vadivelu, which is called principled eclecticism, or sometimes beyond methods. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. Are you familiar with Kamara Vadivelu's work? Are you familiar with this? Yeah, okay. So this guy here, I think is probably the one who's got the closest towards an overarching kind of view of the way we should think about language teaching. I'm not going to go through it in detail. Please spend some time having a look at it. And this particular approach is the one that sort of resonates the most with me, because it's the most inclusive of all of those points I mentioned before. So he talks about being sensitive to specific contexts, strategies that are practical, should be develop strategies that are practical and applicable to specific classroom situations. It's a very flexible approach, and also takes into account social, cultural, and political issues. So some of these are the core principles. A part of this is a very eclectic approach. For those of you who may not know the word eclectic means where you take some parts of things, to have various approaches, I think is the easiest way. So one of the main principles behind his beyond methods approach is to, and I'm going to be reading the red text here, to draw from multiple methods and strategies. Not just choose one, not just CLT, not just CLIL, not just this. To draw from multiple methods in principled ways to tailor the teaching to fit particular needs of students in the learning environment. So this involves teachers being flexible and integrating techniques from various approaches. So you may take something from CLT, something from lexical approach, something from TBL, depending on your situation. And he says that teachers should be decision makers. The teachers themselves should be decision makers rather than people more higher up should, and so on. And the teacher should respond to the social and cultural institutional contexts. If we are actually implementing this, we're going to need needs analysis. It involves reflective practice. The teachers need to reflect on what they're doing. Students should reflect on what they're doing. What are they doing well? What are they not doing well? diverse approaches, make sure that it's culturally relevant, and allow students to think critically about the language and its role. And also means that the teachers need to have adaptive planning. So that's a very, very quick run through of his approach. Now, of course, it's not perfect. There are some issues with it. This is a kind of, or pretty much moving towards the perfect world approach. But the problem, of course, is to be able to do this, you need extremely highly trained teachers who have a lot of experience. They know how to adapt to the changing classroom. You need to have teachers who are very confident in their teaching, confident in being autonomous, and there are many teachers who are not autonomous. They have to function within a system. They're dependent on the course book. They're dependent on their materials that they have. There's also implementation issues. How do you manage your time with this? How do you balance various methods? How do you know what to do when? Which method should you use and when should you use it? There's obviously going to be constraints on doing this if you have very large classes or very limited resources. You may also find that students expect to learn in a particular way, and therefore we need to make sure that their needs are addressed. How would you assess this? It's going to be very difficult. With a very eclectic, principled approach, it means there's going to have to be eclectic and principled assessment, and that also gets into all kinds of issues of how you develop a curriculum. And cultural and social sensitivities. Some communities may be very happy with this sort of approach and others may not. And so out of this, we've had some approaches like Dogme by Scott Thornberry and various others have looked at this, and they've experimented with it, and there's been quite a bit of pushback against these sorts of approaches because you need extremely highly qualified teachers with lots of experience, lots of confidence, lots of resources. So we're kind of limited to go back to where we typically are, which is with, say, typical course books, and that sort of more traditional approach. But all of the above that I've just been talking about doesn't really tell us what to teach and when, in what order and why. It says, oh, take this approach and do this and do the other, but it doesn't really tell us things like how we choose which words to teach, how do we choose which grammar to teach, how do we balance the skills, how much new information should we give versus how much should we be doing reviewing, when do we focus on form or when do we focus on meaning, how do we present meaningfully and check the learning, and how do we build depth of knowledge. So these approaches that I mentioned before are perfectly okay, but the problem is they don't really help the teacher on the ground. You can take a whole master's course in methodology, but it doesn't actually help you on Monday morning, because you may find that you're drowning in theory, but not much on the practical side of things. And so we need to make sure that all of this theory, all of these ideas are actually steeped in practice and have some guiding principles for teachers to follow. So I'm going to present to you 7 principles of language teaching, which you can see here. And these should underlie everything that teachers should be doing. Some of the time they need to pay attention to the language, they need to develop connections between, the grammar and the vocabulary, between the skills. We need to have massive time on task, engage the emotions, beg your pardon, quality of language use, and to develop all the skills and build autonomy. So these are the sort of 7 principles I'm going to put forward to you now in very brief terms. So if we have some idea of what these principles may be, they can start to answer real-life questions for teachers, like, how can I teach vocabulary? What's the best way? What sorts of things do I need to do when I teach vocabulary? What aspects of vocabulary teaching do I need to be aware of? And what principles underlying vocabulary teaching can I implement in my class, and when? How should I create a well-balanced listening course? Am I actually teaching too much? Should I shut up and let the students get on and learn? Are the students getting enough time to practice? How much extensive reading should we do? Do you have a well-balanced curriculum? So these principles that I'm going to go through rather briefly can help answer some of these actual questions which a teacher may ask. If we look at some of the methods that we talked about before, many of the methods don't actually help you with answering, today's class, questions about today's class. So let's move on. The first one is attention to form, that is grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. There's a lot to learn, all the grammatical systems. We know that if you want to read a newspaper without a dictionary, you'll need about 8,000 to 9,000 words. We know that words have various families, so we have not only the main word itself, we have the inflections, and we have the derived forms, user, misuse, useless. So words are not just a simple word like use, they have whole families with them. And also they have multiple meaning senses. Here are 3 meaning senses of bank. Collocations are going to be important. Multiple word units, they need phrasal verbs, idioms, and metaphor. There's a lot to learn. This is just the grammar vocabulary. And I haven't even mentioned pronunciation yet. The second thing is we need to have massive time on task. So we need to make sure that any language that we do teach or we do present to students, it comes back again soon. And the reason for this is because of this thing here known as the forgetting curve, which is probably the single most important concept in education, I would say. If I was to distill education down to one important thing, this is probably it in terms of how we approach pedagogy. Because what it says is, if you teach, say, 20 new words today, we know that within an hour, 50% of that knowledge is lost. We know that within a day, 60 or 70% is lost. Within a week, 80%. By the end of the semester, maybe even 90% is lost. What that says is, if we put our time into teaching and we give them some information, quite a lot of that knowledge is lost if we don't go back over it soon. And so our job as teachers is to be fighting the forgetting curve. It's a critical part of how we design our syllabuses. What we need to do is, as you can see the bottom right picture, the first learning will take our knowledge up to 100%, but very quickly that knowledge will go down. We need to make sure the knowledge comes back again, but of course it's going to start to be forgotten again, and then we go meet it again a little bit later, knowledge is going to be lost again, and so on and so on. So this repeated exposure, systematic repeated exposure, is critically important to help fight the forgetting curve. And we'll come back to talk about whether ELT is actually doing this sometime later. So spaced repetition is very important, particularly at the form meaning level, where you're just learning words or a grammatical feature, or let's say a phrasal verb or a phrase. It's critically important that it comes back again soon. So intentional memorization is an extremely powerful way of just getting to the start of learning of words, grammar, and so on. We also know that it takes between 8 to 50 meetings of a word to learn it. This research is very solid. Of course, it depends on the word. Some words you'll be able to pick up immediately. For example, loan words. If you already have the word in Thai, it'll be very easy to pick up in English. But other words are going to take much, much longer. For example, there are very few people who are non-native speakers of English who have yet mastered the articles perfectly, the, and an. Even though they've met these words countless times. So it is going to take some time. We're going to come back to this 8 to 50 meetings to learn a word later, and why there is such a big spread. So therefore, students need massive exposure to get to the advanced level. Again, we're going to come back to look at this in quite some depth later. The next principle is to build connections, particularly implicit knowledge. Students need to have this sense of how words and grammar fit together. The knowledge is going to be distributed in their head, so they need to make connections between the pronunciation with the meaning, with other words, how collocations go together, the nuances of meaning and associations between words, critically important for the production of language, for students to be able to have a good sense of knowing which words and grammar fit together. Because if they don't have a good sense of language, they're simply not going to be able to use it. If they don't know whether to say, my boyfriend is beautiful or my boyfriend is handsome, they're probably not going to use it. It's not until they feel comfortable with that association will they actually start to use this in their writing and speaking. Collocation is going to be important. Multiple word sequences, they're going to need to know how words fit together in sequences. Awareness of various text types is going to be critically important. And make sure that they know the difference between an email and, for example, an essay, from an academic article, from a newspaper article, from a blog, and so on and so on. The next one is to socialize the learning. We need to make sure that the context of the learning is in a social and cultural context, with as much as we can within the relatively false world of ELT. Reflect real-life language use as much as we can. Make sure the tasks are interactive, and that we develop co-created context. That is, when you're building language conversations, you are co-creating the context. You don't know the direction of that conversation. So students need to listen to and build on what somebody else has said, and then I build on what they have said, and what I build on what they have said, they build. So it's constantly being co-created as we go through the conversation. So students need to learn about co-creating contexts, not just see what somebody else has said, let's say just reading a dialogue. And of course, getting back to engaging the emotions. Quality language use is critically important. Varied, meaningful contexts. We need to have engaging, non-random input. Again, we'll come back to talk about this. That actually stretch the student. Don't stretch the student too much that they get loss of comprehension, but just enough that critical I+1, maybe I+2 at times. And sometimes we even need to go to I-1. Recycling to strengthen the learning. We need to have material that is designed to recycle and strengthen the learning, not just in the same context, but in maybe many other sort of generative contexts. They need to be in other ways than just simply repeating the same phrase in the same way. We need to see the word in different contexts. And build on previous learning. We need to practice all 4 skills, make sure it's integrated, we have some skill transfer, and all of the skills don't just need intentional practice through intensive reading, intensive speaking, and so on. We need to make sure that we also build a fluent and automatic reading, the actual skills of reading, the skills of listening quickly, the skills of speaking quickly, and so on. And again, do this as much as we can in real life situations. And critically important is autonomy. The goal of language teaching is for a teacher to make herself unemployed. So we need to make sure that things we do in class are focusing on helping students to be independent of courses, teachers, and materials. So what skills and strategies, what knowledge the students need to have in order to be independent. And this means also that students need to be looking at materials which are hopefully self-selected, something that matches their personal interest and their choices. So eventually, they won't need the dictionary, and we can just throw them away. So we need to meet their goals, not necessarily our goals. Now, sometimes they all have common goals, but individually they're all going to need their own needs or met and meet their own goals. So we need to reflect that as much as we can. And to help them to internalize the language, to make it their own, with their own idiolects, with their own way of speaking, their own world English, if you will. So that's a kind of very quick run through. These are the 7 principles of learning a second language, which I think should underlie the decisions that we make about which textbook to use, how much material we need to have, what types of material, are we going to focus on what the teacher wants or what the student wants, and so on. And probably on top of all of those, something that's not directly related to an L2, I would say critical thinking skills, critical pedagogy is going to be pretty important in the future, because we can't know what our students are, what kind of world our students are going to inhabit in the future. We need to make sure that they can adapt to whatever the world's going to throw at them. So in terms of these principles, I think it's important to then distill these back to the language classroom. How do we actually approach language teaching? How do we put some of these things into actual practice? And so there have been several ways put forward. to look at how we would implement these things in terms of teaching. So here I have for you a list of various activities. We have explicit teaching. Sometimes teachers do dictionary work. Sometimes we use a grammar book, intensive reading. We might do some language awareness activities and conscious word learning, like here's a word list, go and learn them. On the right, we've got controlled production activities, where students would do a controlled dialogue, for example, or maybe they do sentence completion tasks. We do pronunciation drills or language drills, gap-filled exercises, memorized dialogues. All of these are pretty standard things. On the bottom, we have easy reading, listening, watching movies, browsing the internet. All of these are valuable forms of input for our students. At the bottom on the right, we've got free language production activities where students are, say, talking with their partners, writing about what they want to, casual conversations, debates, discussions, email, and so on. And you're all familiar with these type of example activities. But I think it's important that when we're talking about a framework for ELT, that we have some kind of an idea for how these things fit together. So can anybody say the difference between what's on the left and what's on the right? What's the difference between the stuff that's on the left and on the right? If you would care to either speak up or do something. This should be relatively straightforward, I think. Anybody want to put forward an idea how the stuff on the left is different from the stuff on the right? Anybody want to have a go at it? Okay, well, let me help you out. The stuff on the left is input. So this is largely, for example, reading and listening. And on the right, you've got speaking and writing, generally speaking. So there's also a difference between top and bottom. Can anybody work out how the activities on the top are different from the activities on the bottom? Everybody want to put something forward in the chat window? If anybody wants to put something into the chat. Yeah, Ben, you were right, product. Anybody have a go at the top versus bottom?
You said productive and receptive.
Receptive and receptive is left and right, yes.
Yeah.
So receptive is left and productive is right, yes. But top and bottom, what's the difference between the stuff up here and the stuff down the bottom? They have a different focus, quite a substantially different focus.
I think the top is more directed and the bottom seems to be, I'm trying to find the right language, but not directed, right?
I can sense
what I'm saying? Yeah.
Your word directive, yes, I can see what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not quite the word.
Does that make sense? Okay, yeah.
Yes, it does. It's not quite the word. I wouldn't put it that way, but go on, you're in the right area.
I mean, the bottom part is the students doing sort of what they want on their own. The word free is there.
Yeah.
Directed and non-directed, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Another way to say that is language-focused learning and meaning-focused learning. So all the stuff at the top is there to teach a piece of language, whether it's grammar, vocabulary, idioms, bit of pronunciation. The stuff on the left there, at the top, is all about language-focused learning. How do we actually teach a piece of language? What does the language look like? The sort of descriptive side. The bottom part is about actually using language in communication. That is, you're reading to understand the story. You're listening to enjoy the music, for example. You're watching the movie to enjoy the story. And you're just processing language. And your aim at the bottom is, when you do these things, you're not doing them in order to learn language. You're doing them to practice language. So the top part, we could largely talk about language-focused learning versus meaning-focused learning. And so the top part, the language-focused activities, would either teach or test a language point. Here's a new piece of language, let's have a test about it. And usually they're the start of learning. We all know that just because we teach something doesn't mean it's going to stay in their head forever. So it might just be the introduction. So look, here's the present simple tense, right? Now I don't expect you to remember it, so we'll go over it tomorrow and so on. There's various aspects of the tense. This type of teaching is often done at the whole class level. All the students are being taught about this particular language point together. Not always, but very often that's the way. And as was mentioned, I think, was it Graham mentioned? It's about highly controlled. It is controlled because you're trying to control what input the students get. You're trying to focus them carefully on one particular aspect of the language. And often that involves teaching a rule. The rule is X versus Y. At the bottom is about practice, the real skills of real writing, reading, speaking. And the idea is to focus on general understanding of the language, to get a general idea of what the passage says. And you could, if you wish, want to dig in deeply and get a really deep knowledge. And that's going to be very important, say, for academic study. The idea is to deepen existing knowledge and build connections. So you've already learned the word, you've learned a piece of grammar, but you now need to sort of see, how does it fit other words? How do I see it in context? How do I build a picture in my own mind about how this word works? How do I build connections with the word and its collocations, its colligations? And this allows students to experiment with their knowledge by being able to give them controlled, by giving them meaning-focused activities. They therefore can use the activity to experiment with their knowledge. They can try out something they've learned. So maybe they learned a word in class, and now they're going to try it out and experiment with that knowledge themselves. And it allows students to work at their own pace because they're dealing with these things at their own level. Just a second. So I just want to... I'm just slightly changing one of my slides, moving it around just a moment. Talk to yourselves a second while I move it. So I was just mentioning now about this idea of experimenting with their knowledge, and I'm going to give you a rough idea of how that would work. So let me give you an example here of students experimenting with language. So let's assume that we have a student, a typical student, and she's reading a sentence somewhere in a textbook or a newspaper or whatever it may be. And she comes across this sentence. The student sees the sentence, "The girl saw the ancient temple in the jungle." Now, our imaginary student doesn't know this word ancient. It's a new word. So she reads the word, it reads the sentence and goes, "The girl saw the ancient temple in the jungle." What does this mean? So the very first stage of learning, as we saw with Michael Long, is noticing something. Oh, I don't know this. What is this? I don't know how to pronounce it, don't know what it means. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of guess what I think this word might mean. So I know now there's a word I don't know, so I need to guess what it means. So the student's looking at the sentence going, okay, ancient temple in the jungle. Temple in the jungle. Okay, I'm thinking of Ayutthaya, thinking of Sukhothai, thinking of Angkor Wat. They're very kind of lovely temples, aren't they? Maybe that works. Lovely. How does that work? So she's made a guess. She guessed that the word ancient means lovely, and goes back to the sentence, "The girl saw the lovely temple in the jungle." Okay, well that seems to make sense. Now you and I know that the student's made a mistake here, but it makes sense for the student at that moment, and probably the student will continue to read. So the student's noticed something, she's added it to her knowledge. Now, because she's a good student, the next day when she goes to class, she's going to try out her new word. So remember that she still thinks that ancient is lovely. So she talks to the teacher and says, "Oh, welcome back after lunch. How was your lunch?" And the student says, "Oh, it was really good. I had an ancient sandwich." Right? And of course the teacher goes like, "What?" Let's get some feedback. "What are you talking about? Ancient sandwich? Are you okay? Are you not sick?" "Well, yeah, it's a lovely sandwich." "Huh? What do you mean?" "Oh, well, ancient means lovely, doesn't it?" No. Ancient means old. So now the student's getting some feedback on their input. They're realizing that ancient means old. So the student goes, now I notice that ancient equals old, and now I'm going to add that to my knowledge. So what's happening here is the students are going through this cycle. So the next day, the student comes back, now knowing that ancient means old, They now talk to the teacher again. They say, how was your class? How was your day yesterday? I was really good. I went to the shopping center, and I met my ancient teacher, right? And of course, the teacher goes like, what? No, don't say that. What do you mean? Well, my teacher's old. He's in his 60s, right? You said that I can say ancient means old. Yeah, but actually we use ancient with things. We don't use ancient with people. And now the student notices again, ancient temple, old temple. And ancient is old things. So this is a very sort of brief sort of cycle of learning which students need to go through. We need to make sure that students go through all aspects of this. We don't just cut it by getting to notice something, then add to their knowledge. We need to give them opportunities to try out the language and get more feedback. And therefore they can go around this cycle of learning. And it might take many, many, many times before they work out what a meaning may be, or a collocation, or a piece of grammar. So this cycle of learning is critically important when we're thinking about how we develop our classes. So this is, this structure I mentioned to you before is called the balanced curriculum. It's a sort of ideational approach to looking at how we would see our classes. And the top part, as I say, is language-focused learning, the bottom is meaning-focused learning. But each of these different boxes have slightly different functions. And you can see that this is very closely related to the Paul Nation's 4 strands. The balanced curriculum doesn't really have a fluency component, and Paul and I have talked about this regularly. He thinks there is a need for a fluency component, and I think fluency is an outcome of meaning-focused input and meaning-focused output. So I don't think it's a little bit of speed reading and fast writing is important, but I don't think it deserves, as Paul says, 25% of the class time. So Paul and I disagree on this, so it's going to depend on the class, of course. So if we go back to the balanced curriculum, the first box here we can largely say is about learning stuff. Here's a new piece of grammar, here's some new words, here's a new something. And then this box here is really about checking understand through. By writing about something, by speaking about something, you're actually getting the opportunity to check you understand. That might be a test, or it might be a controlled productive activity. At the bottom part here, we read books and study. We read books and we listen to, let's say, movies and songs and so on to build connections. So we're trying to get a sense of how the language fits together and to develop that implicit knowledge. On your right, you've got speaking your mind, saying what you want to say. That's the output side of things, where you can choose what you want to say, and you're getting feedback on your performance. So for this top left box here, this is all about building language awareness. It's about building basic study skills, building form-meaning relationships, building a working vocabulary, and building, say, for example, systemic word knowledge, for example, the knowledge of affixes, derivatives, and so on. So it has a very strong language focus approach. The bottom right box is all about language control. This is about making sure the students can understand. Did they actually learn? So if you taught them something in this box, did they actually learn it here? Can they actually use it correctly and accurately? So this is really focusing on accuracy. So we want to check that the students know the form. Can they make the present tense properly? Do they know the difference between the present tense and the past tense? Can they spell a word properly? Can they pronounce it properly? Can they choose the correct word? Do they choose the word borrow, or do they choose the word lend? Can they use this in controlled, accuracy-focused language use? Bottom left is about massive language input. It's about building fluency, lexical access speed, finding words quickly in your head. It's about building a sense of how words and grammar go together, building contextual knowledge, and building network knowledge, and learning to read and listen naturally as much as you can. And importantly, building autonomy, being able to learn to read and listen by yourself. Bottom right is, again, learning to write and speak naturally. Gives you the opportunity to get feedback on your community success. It allows you to experiment with your language use and also build autonomy. So all of these things together here will largely give us a framework within which our classes can be constructed. So I've spent quite a bit of time trying to go over some of the sort of core ideas of how we approach language, but we now need to turn and look and say, well, how well are we actually doing with all of this? Yeah. How well are we actually approaching this? So before I move on, I'll take a minute or two to just sort of reflect on where we are. Does anybody have any comments or suggestions or complaints? I do realize this is a very, very superficial view, but this is context is important for what's going to come next. Does anybody have any comments so far?
Can I make a comment?
Sure, go ahead.
The issue that I have is at Thammasat we teach a lot of ESP courses, you know.
Yes. Yes.
So you've got maybe a Thai program that is studying economics, for example, and they have one English class for the semester.
Yes.
And they're all mixed abilities, and we want to expose them to the language of economics, which for a lot of them is way above their A+1 comprehensible input.
Yes.
You've got, they're coming across words that are sort of C1, C2.
Absolutely.
And they're A2 really.
Yes.
And is it a complete waste of time because they're not going to get it? Or are we doing the right thing?
I think if we work on the assumption that many of the people in faculties which are going to lead on to some sort of professional work in the future, whether they be engineers or architects or whatever, they're probably going to need some English. So I would say it's probably good that the university require them to at least do some English. What we tend to find is the non-English majors tend not to see it quite the same way that we do. And I think particularly with the advent of AI technologies, they're thinking even more so, well, do I need the language class because I'll just use my computer or my smartphone to fix it? But I think what we do need to do is to focus them on making sure that they get the words and language they need. I think if you have such a limited time, because a lot of English, I would say 85% of the English language that students meet, even in technical areas, specialist areas, 85% of it is still general English. The technical language actually makes up a tiny proportion, even in technical texts. A lot of it is still general English, words like, you know, go, come, have, accept. These are sort of everyday words. So I think you need to build up their sort of specialist vocabulary. And one way to do that is by giving them, say, word lists of engineering words, giving them word lists of math words or science words or nursing words or whatever. I think that's going to be critically important because at the point I'm going to come to later, memorization of these sort of things is exactly, it's extremely powerful. And while we might consider it somewhat old hat and sort of not very up with the method, so to speak, there is very strong evidence that learning from when we talk about word learning, and I'm going to come back to talk about this a little bit later. When we're talking about word learning, there's basically two stages. The first is the form-meaning connection, where they're matching a word with its concept and its spelling and pronunciation. That sort of initial level of knowledge you can do very quickly through memorization with good memorization techniques, spaced repetition. There's some very good apps to do that. I'll come back to talk about this later. So I think to really speed their learning, I would probably give them 200 or 300 words of technical language in their domain and get them to really go through those. That's the fastest way to build the technical vocabulary that they need, I would suggest.
And it seems to kind of work, but it's just, I mean, the mixed abilities is the other issue because a lot of them,
yes,
it's not comprehensible input at all. It's way out there. Yeah.
So you kind of, with only 1 hour a week, you're kind of forced to go back to sort of intentional study. You're going to have very little that you can deal with at the sort of like the whole class comprehensible level, trying to understand a text, because you're going to have, 5% of your students, it's going to be too easy.
Exactly, yeah.
75%, 60% of his students is like, wow, this is hard. And some of them is like way off the scale. So I'll come back to talk more about this later.
Okay. Thank
if you don't mind, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for your answer.
No, my pleasure, my pleasure. All right, so can I just move on a fraction? So now we're going to look at the next sort of section, which I call the state of ELT. Where are we? What's actually happening? So this, of course, may not be directly related to you and your teaching situation. You're at a good university, at a prestigious college. You're teaching English to people who've already had several years of English. But I'm trying to now focus on sort of the general state of ELT across, let's call it Asia for the moment. Now, I've traveled and worked extensively throughout Asia, and I've been to hundreds of classes, and I've read lots of papers and talked to teachers endlessly and seen them present on the sort of techniques, approaches that they have towards their classes. So how generally is English taught in Asia? Let's just say Asia, in junior high and senior high particularly. Well, one of the major teaching strategies is translation. Now, this might not be for you, but in your average classroom, 200 kilometers from here, you can almost guarantee that translation's happening quite a lot, I would suggest. And you'd say the same thing in China, you'd say the same thing in parts of Taiwan, you'd say the same thing in Laos and Vietnam. Memorization is important. Teachers give students a list of words or a list of features to learn. Go away and learn them. There'll probably be a test tomorrow. And we don't often teach them how to actually learn effectively. That's a huge problem. There's a kind of overemphasis on form, particularly grammar and vocabulary. There's a lot of focus on learning bits and pieces, learning other pieces. We talked before about the top part of the balanced curriculum, and relatively little on skill development. We do have most people have a course book, and teachers will supplement their course book, but what they'll do is they'll sort of say, oh, I'm doing a unit on transport. So what I'll do, okay, I'll go to the internet, there needs some more vocabulary, go to the internet, I'll find a worksheet somebody did on the BBC, and this one is on transport, I'll download it, here students have these words. So we tend to supplement what we're doing, but very often it's not in principled ways. The vast majority of teaching of EFL is centered around a course book of some kind, whether it's a general course book or an academic book, some sort of course book here. I'm using course book not necessarily in the published book sense, but also maybe something you made in-house. It might be a department course book. It might be even your own course materials, lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3. Maybe you've created your own material. And I call that broadly a course book. But in many cases, the course book equals the syllabus. And because students and teachers are under pressure to get through the course book, there's this get through the mentality. Oh, yes, I know we should be doing more work to develop the depth, but it's week 7, I'm only on unit 4, I need to get to week 12, let me just get through the book. This is a very common mentality. There's a very strong test focus, often a very high pressure focus. Students get an awful lot of tests, either tests for this week or maybe their general test, general comprehension test, general proficiency test, sometimes summative, sometimes formative. There's a very strong test focus. And the direction of a lot of language teaching is, how can I get my students into so-and-so high school, so-and-so university? How can I get them to get a higher TOEFL, TOEIC score, whatever? How can I get them to pass the C1 level? How can I get them to that? So there's a lot of test focus. A lot of the learning and direction of the class is teacher-led. As a whole class, it's relatively little individualized, very hard to individualize learning when you've got 40, 50 students in a class. Relatively little real-world relevance. I'll come back to talk about this later. We're only really scratching the surface of, let's say, cultural context. When we're talking about, let's say, you want to read something about Spain, and you've got a short text of 400 words, there's very little you can talk about Spain if you are trying to broaden your students' cultural horizons. Very often the situation is quite negative in terms of affective emotions. Many students, where I teach a lot in Japan, a lot of the students have a fear of making mistakes. They feel the pressure of the class moving too quickly, or the pressure of a test coming up, or the pressure of the amount of work they've got. So if we just look at a typical course book, this particular course book here is from China. It's a very low-level course book. This book is not much different from most other course books. And I want you to look at it not so much as the book itself, but just look at the sort of step back and sort of say, well, look at what's actually happening in the book. And let's look at the balance of language-focused learning versus meaning-focused learning. And your textbook might be similar. So this is a beginning level book. So we have various units, unit 1, 2, 3, 4 here. We have a recycle unit after 3 units, and then we have recycle 2. We have appendices as well. So this is very low level. So unit 1 here, you can see that the activity here is, it's a controlled dialogue. It's a display dialogue. It's here to demonstrate the be verb plus some adjectives of character, like what somebody like, he's clever, he's polite, and so on and so on. On the right here, we can also see that the function of these activities is to display the target language in a context. So all of these things here, it doesn't really look like a normal sentence. It's quite contrived because the teacher's trying to present language. So we couldn't really call this communicative. This is really about, it's language-focused input, and it's there to model the language. Yes, you could, repeat the sentences, but that would be controlled language production, and probably again is language focus. So the aim here is to display, to introduce the form in some form of context. On the next page, again, we have a dialogue here. You can see, and again, this is, do you know? No, I don't. Yeah, he's amusing. Is he young? Is he funny? So this is, again, trying to demonstrate the same sort of material, and this time through listening. Down here, we have a kind of control production activity, kind of fill in the blank. Who's your teacher, Miss White? Is she kind? Yes, she is. Is she tall? Is she friendly? Is she quiet? Yes, no. And on the right here, again, who's your art teacher, Mr. Jones? So all of this here is controlled language production, very carefully structured, very accuracy focused. It's getting it right, displaying the form in very, very controlled ways. And of course, nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly fine to do this. And so this is controlled accuracy focused input. And at the bottom on the right, here we have a bit more open conversation. Who's Miss Smith? Now, I suppose you could use your own sentences here, but again, you're limited to the sentences which are on the page. In this activity, again, similarly, you're having more controlled, this is a contextualized listening model. Again, going over the same language. Is she strict? Do you know her? Yes, she's my mother, right? And then down here, we're having a controlled productive activity. This here is a gap fill. Again, you have to choose the correct word into here. This is an accuracy-focused, language-focused activity. On this page, again, you're going to have to fill in with the blank. This is an accuracy activity here. I'm not really quite sure what this is all about. The previous, this whole unit has been about the be verb and adjectives of character, but here we've now got modal verbs in there, past tenses in there. I don't really know what this is all about. It seems to somehow miss the context of what's been going on before. So if this is a consolidation activity, I don't think it's working very well because there's very little language in there, which they've already taught. So if we think about the course books that we tend to use, and we look at the percentage of activities which are language focused, and the percentage of activities are meaning focused. Take a moment to think about this. What percentage of stuff in a typical course book would be language focused? And what percentage do you think would be meaning focused? Now, think about your own text. I'm going to put a number on the board, on the page in a minute or so. And the number I come up with has come out of some research one of my students did. She analyzed 3 series of textbooks 18 books in total, looking at the textbook plus the workbook that comes with it, analysed every single activity in all of these books. So what do you think percentage would be language focus in a typical, let's say, junior high, senior high textbook? Anybody want to take a guess? What do you think? 20%, 50%, 60%, 70%? What do you think? What percentage would be language-focused learning?
75?
75? Wow, that's high. Okay. Any more? Any other people?
Yeah, I think probably 80%, something like that.
80, wow.
High, very high.
Okay, right. Actually, no, I'm sorry, you're wrong. 97%.
Oh.
97% of the activities in course books are language-focused learning activities. 0% is meaning-focused input. 3% is meaning-focused output. Have a conversation by yourself or write something. 97% is language-focused learning. And I'm going to give you the slides later. And what it shows, not just in this book, but in the books that my student analysed, is that almost all the activities are either teaching something new or checking was understood through controlled exercises. There were very few productive activities. When they were highly controlled. They were not free, focused on accuracy. So largely, this is a language-focused learning book. This is not a 4 skills book. And when my student looked at the data, this is the data itself. You're going to get the slides later, go over it later. But basically, you can see whether the context, the presentation was contextualized or rule-focused, practice was of a form, the practice was of a meaning, the practice of the form plus meaning, productive side of things, was it controlled speaking, controlled writing, free speaking, free writing, and extensive reading down here. So this one had 860 different activities. The vast majority were here and all the way across. So that's an incredible piece of work that this lady's done. This is the number of activities, and these are the percentages. And if you add them together, this is where you get your 97%. So what this seems to suggest is we have a very, very unbalanced approach. Now, you might find for the university text a little bit more. You might find on the meaning-focused stuff. But again, a lot of the activities, even in the higher level course books, the sort of B2, C1 books, it's still largely, the texts are largely written to display the grammar and vocabulary. So if we look, for example, at another text, let's say this text here is one that you might get at the elementary level and intermediate level. You can see here that the text is quite short, 200, 300 words maybe. It's trying to teach new words like orbit, trying to teach words like spin, noon, right? And you can see inside here that the language that's used is to display possibly the grammar function of the unit, maybe some kind of linguistic function, and also the vocabulary. Following it, you'll get comprehension activities, vocabulary activities, and grammar activities. And I think more than likely a course book that you use probably has a similar design. That is, here's some language, either through listening or through reading. The language is there essentially, not really about the topic, it's really to display the language, the grammar and vocabulary that you want to teach in the area. It's not really about building the skill of reading or listening. So the other issue that we need to think about when considering course books is, if you think about the course book that you have, I pretty much guarantee that the course book that you're using, the design of the course book that you're using, is similar to every other course book you've ever used. Nearly all course books, and I think I probably have found only 1 or 2 course books in my life which do not have the same design. Nearly all course books have the same design. Not the same content, but the same design. And let's look at that design. So the design here is, think about this at the sort of macro level. We have different units. Here we've got 5 units. This is the contents page. Nice greetings, something to do with home, something to do with favorites. It's about clothes. This is about upstairs, downstairs. So new topic, new topic, new topic, new topic, new topic. We also have new vocabulary, new functions, new structures, new pronunciation, new reading, new listening. And if you think about a course book that you use, the contents page probably looks like this. Not just in ELT. If you have a math course book or an engineering course book or a history course book, it's largely the same design. And what is that design? Well, the design is something like this. We have different units. We have, within English, a grammar function for the unit and maybe some vocabulary. So this would be simple adjectives like she's hot, I'm tired, they're cold. Unit 2 would be new grammar and some new vocabulary. So these daily routines, I get up at 7 o'clock, I have a bath or a shower, I go downstairs, I clean my, I have my breakfast, go to school. And then present continuous, we have some sporting activities. They are playing football, he is playing basketball. I can ride a horse, I can't speak Spanish, and so on. So what you see here, you'll notice that these daily routines, right, this vocabulary here will not come again later in Unit 5 about health. These sporting activities will not come again in Unit 11, which is about, say, technology. So what we have here is a linear, one-direction syllabus. And what it's saying is, we're teaching the be verb, we're teaching the simple adjectives, we will not recycle them, except maybe in a review unit, minimal recycling. We will not revise them because we only need to teach something one time. And because we've taught it, we don't need to recycle it, and therefore they've learnt it forever. They've learnt it forever, we don't need to recycle it. So now we can move to the next unit. So this is the predominant design of most course books. And I call this one-hit teaching. Teach and drop, teach and drop, teach and drop, right? So, as I mentioned to you before, the most important graph in all of education is our forgetting curve. We're going to learn something, but we know we're going to forget, right? Our job is to fight this. So what's going to happen to this? Well, of course, this is going to happen to this, right? Of course, students are going to be forgetting about the material that they have learned. So you have a student who's honestly tried. They've taken your class, they've loved your class, they've loved the course book, they've loved the material, they got 10 out of 10 on every activity, they do all of this stuff, they absolutely love the class, but they get to the end of the semester and there's a big test tomorrow, so they open their course book to go back and look. And then they look at the book and say, well, I don't remember this, and I don't remember this, and what's this? Is this my writing? So students look back and they've forgotten something. And they say, well, why is this? What? Huh? I don't quite understand, because I love my teacher, I love the course book, I really enjoyed the class, it was a fantastic course, but I don't remember anything. Why? And they say, well, it can't be the teacher, it can't be the course book. The only place they can look is inside. They say, well, I'm not good at learning English. And this design builds in demotivation. Because students are not meeting the language again and again and again repetitively, because it's not being recycled, students will forget. And because they've put the effort in and they've tried, but the learning wasn't deep enough, therefore they're going to forget it, therefore they feel a failure. And when we talk about our students and we talk about them being demotivated, this is often part of the reason why. So as a teacher, we need to look at our course books. We need to look back and see, is the course actually balanced or not? Is your course book enough? Am I testing them too much? Am I testing them too little? Are materials at the right level? A comment that was just made before. Am I balancing language-focused learning with meaning-focused learning? Do my students get enough speaking, listening practice? Do my students get enough reading and writing practice? And so on and so on, yeah. and I'm building independent learners. So often you'll find that teachers are given a course book and they're given a remit to teach students whose, as we heard before, students of various ability levels, students who have only an hour or two in English. There's almost nothing much we can do, and it gets very frustrating for students and very frustrating for teachers. So we need to look at the sort of, at the course director level, we need to look at exactly how much language you can get. But we're often tied by the curriculum. If you're teaching, say, engineering students, the engineering department may say, look, we can only give you 2 classes a week, do what you can. But if they expect us as teachers to get their students to be absolutely fluent in English with 1 or 2 classes a week, well, that's just not going to happen. So we need to have a conversation there. And this is not unique to Thailand. This is the same in Japan, same in Thailand and Korea and everywhere. It's very frustrating for everybody. We often have goals which are way more ambitious than what's actually achievable in the classroom. So I want to move on a little bit about vocabulary. What do we know about the teaching of vocabulary within ELT? Well, one thing we do know is there's too much focus on one-hit learning. Not enough exposure, comprehensible input. Just because we teach something doesn't mean they've learned it. This is really critical. We all know that we may meet some new words or new grammar, but very quickly it's going to be forgotten if we're not careful. Initial word knowledge, initial grammar knowledge is very fragile, very easy to forget. There's not enough exposure. Students meet too little language. We'll come to talk about that in a second. We also know that words live with other words. We know there's collocations, colligations, lexical phrases. There are phrasal verbs, multi-word units, and so on. We also know that written and spoken vocabulary are not the same. We don't write the way we speak. We need a much smaller vocabulary, which is largely Anglo-Saxon vocabulary. Written vocabulary tends to be more Latinate or more Greek. They're not quite the same. Grammar of vocabulary, the grammar of written and spoken language is not the same either. We also know that some words are more difficult to learn than others, and so on. Not all words are equally frequent. We know that some are much more useful than others. Students, beg your pardon, often don't get many chances to network their knowledge to build a sense of language. There's not enough skill building, networking knowledge, not enough time doing systematic, intentional learning above the intermediate level, particularly of vocabulary. One of the biggest holes, I think, in ELT is there are very, very few programs which have systematic vocabulary learning across the department. It tends to be we just rely on our course book. Students, as we know, should learn the most frequent useful words before they can specialize. This is the comment that was mentioned before. Many of my students don't even have the basic vocabulary and grammar, but we're asking them to do high-level academic stuff. We also know that learners cannot guess new meanings from context if the surrounding text is too difficult. We know that students who don't have a dictionary, let's say when they're taking a test, need about 98% of the other words before they can guess successfully from context. Yeah. So I'm going to take a little bit of a break here for about 5 minutes or so, and then we're going to come back to look a little bit more deeply at vocabulary and its implications for ELT. We'll move on from that to look at how we're going to actually solve some of these problems. So please take a break for about 5 minutes or so. And I'll pause the recording. Oh, still a lot more to say. No, not usually. Okay, everybody, let's continue. How do I resume? Okay, resume the recording. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to talk a little bit more about vocabulary. And again, as this is a review of the state of ELT, I think it's important that we look at vocabulary and how it is dealt with within ELT. Vocabulary is, in my opinion, the critical element of learning a language. Grammar is important, but as was famously once said, you can't learn a language without the vocabulary. You have to have lots of vocabulary. Okay, so there's a lot to learn. We looked at this before. I showed you this on a slide previously. 2,000 core important words, 4,000 words to become lower advanced, 9,000 word families to read native text. The average native speaker would probably know between 25 to 30,000 word families. I'm not going to go into the technical detail of what a word family means. It gets quite deep, but basically it refers to the word plus its inflections plus its derivatives. There are many types of vocabulary. Here are some that you're familiar with. Individual words, their derived forms, multi-part words, lexical phrases, idioms, sentence heads. All of these are in need of teaching and learning. The advantage with these is because we have a very clear form and meaning relationship. You can see a book, you can translate it, you can see what table is, you know what it means. These things can be memorized. You can put them into some kind of systematic vocabulary learning program. Some word lists, hopefully spaced repetition lists, that will help the students to learn. These can be learned intentionally. But there's some aspects of vocabulary like collocations and collocations, which you're not really able to teach. There's just too many of them. And some of them are actually very infrequent. The collocations naturally are going to be less frequent than the words that make up them. So high season, for example, is going to be far less frequent than the frequency of high and the frequency of season. So, but students do need to know that we say high season, we don't say top season, we don't say weak cheese, we don't say yellow hair. They also need to know collocations. Now, some of you may not be familiar with the term collocation, but the G here refers to grammar. So think of it as word grammar. We say agree to do something, not agree do something. Agree on, not agree of. Rely on someone, not rely at someone. Have an effect on, So this word grammar is critically important, and unfortunately, a lot of teachers, when they just teach the word agree, will say agree means so-and-so, but they don't actually teach the full grammatical form of the word. And it's critically important that we know whether you can use the infinitive or the gerund, whether you should use which preposition or adverbs that go with it. Because without that, they can't build a sentence. And verbs, as you know, are the center of a sentence. Everything hangs around a sentence. I beg your pardon. Everything in a sentence hangs around the verb. So because there's too many of them, these often have to be picked up from exposure. The next thing is there are thousands of collocations. So as you know, we say the things on the left. We don't usually say the things on the right. You can say them, but if you want to be an advanced level of learner, you need to learn the collocations. So it's more than just learning the word meaning itself. It's also learning the partners. So how many are there? How many different collocations are there? Well, if you just take the word abandon, I beg your pardon, if you take the word idea, for example, how many different collocations can you think of? So in your head, just come up with a few. You tell like good idea, have an idea, think of an idea, abandon an idea. If you just spend 10 seconds thinking about it, how many different collocations of idea do you think there are? 10, 15, 20? More? Let's look. These are the verb. Abandon an idea, absorb an idea, accept an idea, adjust to an idea, advocate an idea, amplify an idea, advance an idea, Those are the verbs. These are the adjectives. Abstract idea, absurd idea, advanced idea, ambitious idea, resting idea, basic idea. Now, all the native speakers who are here will know every single one of these. And they'll know the difference between a diabolical idea and a preposterous idea. They'll know the difference between a controversial idea and, for example, a misconceived idea. And that's why they're native speakers. This is what they know. As an advanced speaker of English, if you know 50% of these, that's great. But to be an excellent speaker of English, you're going to have control of lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of these collocations. And it's critically important that you do know collocations, because you want to be able to speak with the correct collocation, write with the correct collocation. Because if you say things like, I went with my beautiful boyfriend to the shop, he has yellow hair. Clearly, people understand what you mean, but it doesn't sound natural. So students need to have control over these. And a lot of these things are just too infrequent that they have to be picked up from exposure. We don't have time to teach all of these. It's just not possible. So we also have lexical phrases. So for example, these ones here, out of and percent and such as. So which of these would you teach and which of these would you not teach? And so typically, I think most of you looking at this list, you're probably going to say, well, these are going to be pretty important. Maybe I would teach them, maybe I don't need to teach them because they're going to pick them up, they're going to meet them frequently. These ones here seem quite infrequent, and probably I wouldn't teach them. If we actually look at the data here, so the lexical phrase out of is the 177th most frequent language form in the British National Corpus. It occurs 490 times every million words. So if we were to say a word has to be met, say 20 times every million words, it's probably worth your teaching time. Words after that may not be worth your teaching time. Some of them are very specific, like habeas corpus, right? Quite a lot of them are very, very rare. And they're not worth your time. As I said, teachers are very good at identifying these. They're very good at identifying low-frequency words. The problem for most teachers and most students is this in-between category. We're not very good at deciding whether this is worth our time. These are going to be worth your time with direct intentional teaching, probably. These may not be worth it, depending on your context. So getting some kind of an idea of which phrases to use is critically important. Getting a sense of frequency is very important for teachers, because then you know this is worth their time, this is not worth their time. One of the critical aspects of vocabulary learning I've already talked about that is often misunderstood in ELT is the fact we don't just have the first stage of learning, which is the form-meaning relationship. That is where we match the spelling and sound to a meaning. So apple is pronounced apple. I don't know how to say that in Thai, but that's the meaning. That's it. This is where the vast, vast, vast majority of vocabulary teaching stops. It stops at this relationship between the spelling, the sound, and the meaning. But there's a lot more about a vocabulary word that needs to be known. And here are some other aspects. The multiple meaning senses, the nuances of how it's used, its frequency, its usefulness. How do I use it in context? Is it scientific? Is it medical? Is it plant? Is it technology? And so on. When can I use it? When can I not use it? Is it polite? Is it casual? Is it rude? Is it spoken? Is it formal? Is it informal? How quickly can I access that word? Do I have fluent control over it? Can I automatically recognize it? Do I know its collocations? All of this stuff, this is the hard work of vocabulary. To be able to really use words well, you're going to need to know quite a lot of this stuff. If you don't really know how to use it properly, you're going to use it improperly. You maybe use a polite word when you should be casual. You might use a rude word in polite conversation. You might use a spoken word, which actually is more likely to be written. And so you're not going to use the language well. So in order to get a deep sense of how to produce language well, you're going to need to know a lot of these deeper aspects of vocabulary learning. And as we saw before, this can be memorized. whereas this has to be picked up from exposure. This is Paul Nation's table of aspects of word knowledge. I'm not going to go through it, but basically there's form, there's meaning, there's use. And if you want to know about a word, these are some of the things you need to ask. How is it written? How is it spelled? In what patterns can we use this word? What can the items refer to? And so on. So if you really want to know a word and its multiple meaning senses, you're going to need all of this as well. And again, this cannot be taught, even for the 2,000 most frequent words in English. You cannot teach all of this stuff. There is way, way, way too much. We also know there is various states of knowing. Sometimes you might know a word really well, and you can use it productively. The word apple, instantly available. You may know the word quite well, but you can't use it productively. It's on the tip of your tongue, but it doesn't come out, or you can't quite pronounce it well. You might recognize it and retrieve it quickly, but it's not available for production. It might be recognized, but retrieved slowly. It's like, what's this word? I think it means this, or not recognized. So there's various states of knowing, and students would go through from this state, would move all the way up to here. So this is why a lot of vocabulary knowledge is down here. Very few words that students know is actually available up here. And we'll look at the reasons for that in a moment. So we're talking about intentional learning. Even for the 2,000 most basic words of English, each of those typically has 2 or 3 derived forms. It'll be use becomes misuse or disuse. An average word has 2 or 3 meaning senses. We need to meet each word, let's say, 10 times in order to learn it. So if we do the basic math on this, if we have 2,000 words, each has 2 or 3 derivatives. That's 5,000 learning events. Each of those derived forms has 2 or 3 meaning senses, and you need to learn it 10 times. That's 125,000 individual learning events just for the 2,000 basic words. So if each word on top of that has collocations and is involved in some phrases and idioms, there is no way we can teach all of this intentionally. So we need a plan B. So if we now look at course books, this is we now look at how much text is actually in the course book. So these are senior high school textbooks. This is in Japan. You can see here there's 816 different words, total of 3,967 words in 2 books. In this series, which is Crown, there are 3 books, total of 2,600 different words, 34,000 in total, right? So this is typical. You can see the average here varies depending on the book itself. Why is that important? Well, before I talked about we need massive input. So if students are going to need 5 million words, which is what they're going to need, that's about 250 textbook series, if it's 20,000 words a series. That's an awful lot of language. So if we have the idea about how many total words students need to meet to get to the advanced level, to get to an advanced level, how many total words do students need to meet? It's not 50,000. It's not 500,000. It's not that one. It's not even that. To get to the advanced level, with the amount of repetitions of words in order to get them to the advanced level, not even 1 million words. They're going to need 4 million words. That is all of Harry Potter 4 times. If you read all of Harry Potter 4 times, you will have a 4,000 word vocabulary. Most students don't get anywhere near that amount of vocabulary. So here's another table. You don't need to look at the data. Basically, all you need to do is to look at the important words in red. This is analysis of the course books. Many of the most important words in the new general service list are not in course books, right? So at these various bands of level, 62% are in, 71%. So there's 30 to 40% of the words are not in the 2,800 general service words. So these are Japanese textbooks approved by the government, but there are about, let's say, 1,000 words, 1,000 frequent words, which are supposed to be taught, but they don't even appear one time. This is another analysis. This also shows that hundreds of words will never be met in junior high or senior high. 62% of the recommended word list, 49% of the government recommended word list are actually in the course books, meaning more than 50% of the words the students are required by the government to learn are not even in their course books. They're not even exposed to them. This is another piece of data that shows that Japanese school students know about 1,600 words after 8 years of instruction, which is not a lot. And we'll come back to what I mean by 1,600 words in a moment. So the same person who did the research before looked at the total number of items which were met more than 10 times. Remember before I talked about 10 times is the sort of basic amount of exposure you need to get to the form-meaning relationship. You see a word, you can recognize it slowly in context. Doesn't mean you can use it, but 10 times will get you recognition, slow recognition. And it says that in the New Crown textbook, these are junior high books here, it said that these words in yellow are the sublists of the words in the government recommended word list. And these are the words not in the government recommended word list. So these are the words in yellow we need to look at. So basically what it's saying is, across a student who does 3 years with these books, plus their workbook, textbook, workbook, all of that together, they will meet 1,047 words 10 times. They'll meet an additional 100 words outside the word list. That's a total of, 1,200 words, let's say, 1,150 words. And in this one, 832 words plus another 185. So in this one, they're going to learn less than 1,000 words in 3 years. In the senior high textbook, you'll find that it's not even as high. So what we've got here is, what we're seeing here is that there's a problem where students are just not meeting the language that they need. So let's look at this table. So this one here is, what's your vocabulary size? So your vocabulary size is, let's say you know 2,000 words. How many total words of language input do you need to meet to get to, say, 2,000 words? Well, as I said before, 10 meanings will get you to form recognition. That is, you can recognize it on a test. Let's call it test vocabulary. 20 meetings will allow you to be able to recognize it probably in context, in reading, and you probably don't need a dictionary. That's called reading vocabulary. You'll need 50 meetings for controlled productive use, say in writing in an essay, where you've got your dictionary next to you, you've got plenty of time, and so on. Let's call that your writing vocabulary. So, if you want a 2,000 word test vocabulary, 2,000 word reading vocabulary, or 2,000 word writing vocabulary, you're going to need these number of words. 2,000 test vocabulary, you're going to need to be exposed to about 350,000 words. 240,000. 478,000 words will get you a reading vocabulary of 2,000 words. 1.2 million will get you a writing vocabulary of about 2,000 words. And if we now look at the same data, but here if you look at all the total words met in junior high and senior high within the North Asia context, the Japan, let's say Korea, Japan, Taiwan, even Vietnam, the amount of words in the textbooks, the students at the end of the course will have a 2,000 word test vocabulary. That is, they can have a vocabulary test size of 2,000 words. Their reading vocabulary, let's say in context with a dictionary, they can deal with 1,500 words. They probably have 600 to 700 words available for writing if they use their dictionary, but only 200 to 300 for speaking. And if you go to Japan, if you go to Korea, I beg your pardon, go to Japan, go to Vietnam, go to many places, go and talk to your average student, average person on the street, they probably can use about 200 words, right? And if you give them a reading passage, they would understand more. If they have a dictionary, they can probably write more. And so what we see here, what we see on the street, the actual ability of the students to really say something, really write something, or take a test, is a direct outcome of the amount of language that they meet. The amount of language they meet has a direct outcome on what they can actually use. So when the man before was talking about the problems with his students, my guess is that most of the students probably haven't met enough language, and that's the critical problem. So if they want to be an advanced learner, let's say you want to get into a master's program, then you're going to probably need to be able to write your thesis about 7 million words of exposure to be able to get to this kind of level. And that's an awful lot more language to get to, say, for C1 level. Very often, universities, particularly English departments throughout Asia, they have a goal for their students to get C1 in order to graduate from the school. But they only provide the students with, let's say, 1 million or maybe 2 million words of input. So there's a huge gap between the amount of language that students actually meet and what they should meet in order to get to these levels. So we also know from research by ProLingua how long it takes. I don't quite know the basis of this, but basically it's saying to get from TOEIC 200 level all the way through to TOEIC 900 level, you need about 1,750 hours. I think this is normed on European populations. I don't think this is normed on, say, Japanese or Thai students. And this is a useful table because it says how long it needs to take. But what you'll notice, this is a similar table. Just a second. The Japanese ministry, for example, says that the amount of time required for a Japanese person to master English is considered 2,200 hours. This is what the Japanese Education Ministry says. To master English. However, they only give 1,160 hours of English in all of their classes from elementary to high school, not even halfway. So, the goal is way up here, but they don't provide anywhere near enough time to get anywhere near what they say is their goal. This is another piece of data, which I think is very important. If you're at the TOEIC 250 level, you only need 1 more hour to get 1 more point. If you're at the TOEIC 450 level, you need 2 hours to get 1 more point. If you're at the 850 level, you need 4 hours of instruction to get 1 more point. So what it says is it gets increasingly difficult, as we saw with the data before, with the number of hours, the amount of language that students need to meet. So what does this mean? Well, if we look at South Korea and we look at Japan on the international scale of language proficiency, you can see that South Korea is significantly higher than Japan on the international scale of English ability. And what is the reason for that? Well, this tells you everything. On the left are the Korean textbooks, on the right are the Japanese textbooks. The more input you get, the higher your language will be. End of story. So if you have textbooks which are thin, they don't have enough language, clearly there's going to be a problem. So what this means is, as I said, there's a direct correlation between the amount of language met and their reading ability. Students will not improve unless they meet a huge amount of vocabulary. To get from A1 to A2, you need 200 to 350,000 words. From A2 to B1, 500 to 700,000. From B1 to B2, 800 to 1 million words. From B2 to C1, 1 million to 1,500 words. So that is about 4 million words to get from A1 to C1. And that's the amount of language students should be meeting. If you come into university A1, A2, and the goal is to get them out at C1, C2, the university should expose them to 3 to 4 million words at minimum. As you know, looking at those figures, Nowhere near that amount of language is being met. So what we find is that students only exposed to 300 to 400,000 words in 4 years, even English department students. And that students tend to graduate at A2 to B1. The average exit level of your typical undergraduate student from an English department is around A2, B1. And that's a direct result of the amount of input they get. Now, that might not be the case at this university, it's a high-level university, but your average university throughout Asia. So one of the issues that we often get is that the students are so unmotivated and they don't want to study English. And what are some of the reasons for this? Well, teachers may say things, oh, the students don't work hard enough. Maybe the students are unmotivated. They don't understand the topic. Their English level is too low. And these are the typical sort of responses that you get from teachers who say about their students, I wish my students were more motivated. The reasons are they don't work hard enough. But I think if we look at this accurately, we really should look at it and say, well, what we're doing here is blaming the student. We're not blaming the instructor, we're not blaming the system, we're not blaming the curriculum or the approach, because actually the instructor, the system, the curriculum, the approach are probably the problem. It's probably not the student. Because we say that students don't work hard enough. Well, actually, students will work hard if they sense the course is useful and achievable. You know, students say, we often say they're unmotivated. Well, no, they've elected to choose this course. So of course they're motivated. They want the reading class because they want to learn to read. Or they don't understand the topic. Well, often it might be they didn't get enough preparation before we read. We just give them the reading or give them the speaking activity without preparation. Or the English level's too low. Oh, my students, their English level's too low. No, the reading text is too high. So we're asking them to run before they can actually walk. So what we really need to do, instead of asking this question, we need to look at this and sort of say, well, maybe the texts that we're using are inappropriate. The material, the coursebook's too high, it's not the right level. We need to stream students to the right level. So instead of saying, why are my students so unmotivated, the ELT industry really needs to say, what did I do to demotivate them? What are we doing at the instructor level, the system level, the curriculum level, the approach level? What are we doing to demotivate our students? So we need to reflect, I think, quite carefully on what we're actually doing. So students will really only read will really only study properly if the reading is easy. If it's too difficult, clearly this is going to happen. But the way that we teach students to read is often reading or listening as testing, as we saw before in the textbooks. Short passages, 200 or 300 words. Then let's say the passage is 250 words, there's 12 units. That's only 3,000 words in a book. Words are not met enough times to be learned forever. Research shows that the average word that's taught in a textbook is only met 2 times. It's only met 2 times in the unit. 40% of words are met 1 time or less. One time only. 40% are met 1 time. There are very few examples of grammar patterns in our course books. The reading is slow and intentional and intensive. And everybody's reading the same material and everybody's going the same pace. Too easy for some, too difficult for others. And that's a problem we've got with trying to teach reading at the whole class level. So when students do read, they end up scratching all over their books like this. And I think it's important to see that the students themselves have to read these texts intensively. And what do I mean by an intensive text? Please read this. Now, I guess even the native speakers reading this are struggling a little bit, right? You might understand the words, but it's like, what the heck is this about, right? So how's your comprehension? Huh is probably how you're feeling. You're like, what? What's this word? What's this a perennial juxtaposition? What the heck does that mean? Empirical verisimilitude? What does that mean? Heuristic abstraction, what? So this is how we often read, but if the text is easier and we simplify it in some way, then it's much easier to understand. You can read it easily, you can read quickly, and you can remember the content much better. But very often the students are reading text like this, like, what is this word? What's this topic? I can't understand this. The problem is having texts which are too difficult. So what do we mean about something that's too difficult? And what we got here is there are various levels. Yeah? So this is what we call studying. This is language-focused learning. This is meaning-focused learning. So if we look at the percentage of words that are necessary to know already before you can read a text comfortably, is it 70% of words you need to know already? 80% of words? 90% of words? Well, we know that the percentage of words you need to know already before you get to the text is actually higher than 95. It's 98%. So this is 70% coverage. You know 70% of the words, 30% you don't. You can hardly guess the topic, right? You know it's about a train, it's describing the train, but that's all you know. These other words you don't know, you can't possibly guess. Even at 80%, it's hard to guess what the other words mean. Comprehension's low, you're going to need your dictionary, it's going to be slow. You can't guess from context. Even with 90% coverage, again, there's about 6, 7 words here that they don't know. Approaches are kind of hard to guess. This is probably an adjective. What type of ticket desk? I don't know. Would you like to take a test after reading this? No, you wouldn't, right? Even with 90% of the words already known. Even at 95, it's still troublesome. It's still difficult to guess what these words mean, right? So the point is here, we need to make sure that we are actually making sure that the students get the text at the right level. This is actually the original text. It doesn't really matter what the text is. So given a review of what we've got, what do we rarely see in ELT? Well, we rarely see systematic vocabulary learning programs at the curriculum or school level. We rarely see massive, systematic, meaning-focused input programs. By this extensive reading, extensive listening, this massive amount of language is often missing from certainly course books and many language programs. If it is, the course book is emphasized or something else, or a test is emphasized. There's relatively little adaptive learning. All the students are reading the same material. And the cultural context and real-world application, pragmatic uses is often missing, I think, when we are thinking about language teaching. The personalization and respect for learner differences is not something you see a lot in course materials. Critical thinking, cognitive engagement skills, again, not very high. Local language variations is something we're missing. So as we saw before, there were some principles that we talked about that are important in ELT. And when we think about the sort of, you've all seen this metaphor of culture. So if we're teaching, let's say, culture through English, content through English, we're probably only ever going to get to the tip of the iceberg if there's a limited amount of input. If you're doing a unit on, say, festivals in Spain, and the next one is like festivals in Mongolia, the next one is something about Indonesia, you're only ever going to get extremely surface level understanding, possibly that would lead to stereotypical learning. So we're going to need a different solution. Obviously, more time in class is going to be a solution. So what we don't see, we're not doing very well. What we do have a problem with is that we have an overemphasis on form-focused learning, critically insufficient input. We have a teach and drop approach that doesn't lead to depth of learning. We tend to have poor planned recycling. A lot of the materials we give the students don't fight the forgetting curve. A lot of the materials designed are relatively random. They're sort of random, unprincipally selected. without really knowing why we're doing it. And as I said before, course books can only scratch the surface of all of the cognitive, emotional, social, cultural engagement stuff. And there's a lack of fluency development. Yeah? So the good side of course books is that they can introduce new language and they can give control practice. They can't do everything. Let's not be, let's not even pretend to assume the course books can do everything. They can't. So they're good at some things, but they're not good at developing depth of knowledge, developing actual reading, writing, listening, speaking skills, giving freedom of expression, not good at fighting the forgetting curve, and exposing students to lots of language. So for a bit of fun, I went to ChatGPT and I asked it this question: how would you design a foreign language course to guarantee students become demotivated and hate English, right? Now, ChatGPT came to said, well, this is probably not a very good idea, but just as a kind of, it was an interesting thought experiment. What did it say? Well, this is how you kill your students. First, overemphasize grammar and drills. Ignore learner needs and interests. Everybody does the same stuff. Minimize interaction and communication. Provide incomprehensible input. Give no feedback or only negative feedback. Use uninteresting and irrelevant materials. Create a negative, high-pressure learning environment. Ignore cultural contexts. Avoid using technology or modern resources. Overload the students with information. Isolate the language skills. Never review or reinforce previous learning. Give inconsistent and unpredictable assignments. Provide no real-world application. And impose high-stakes testing only. So, some of the things I've been talking about before, we're actually doing quite a lot of this in our language classes, right? Quite a lot. As I say, there's too much grammar and drills. We saw 97%. Learner needs are not being met very much. And while we certainly can complain and poke fun at our industry, the source problem is that we really don't have enough time with our students. We don't have enough time. We're expecting them to do too much, too soon, too quickly. So we have to make best use of our time as much as we can do. So if we're looking at language learning that only uses course books, there's probably only a few of these aspects of foreign language learning, which I mentioned a couple of hours ago, which we're going to really do well with course books only. All the rest of the stuff, we're not really going to get very close. So what we need is a different solution. What we need to do is to continue with our course books, but we need to have systematic reading and listening material that practices only this grammar and vocabulary. Lots and lots of material at this level to supplement our course books. And then this grammar and vocabulary is supplemented by these materials, because these materials are written to have this grammar and vocabulary and this grammar and vocabulary. So we're systematically building. Level 3 materials will have this grammar and vocabulary built on previous knowledge. So we need to have scaffolded learning. We need to make sure that the learning comes back again and again. We need to have the initial learning, but because of forgetting, we need to relearn. We need to relearn. We need to relearn. So the textbook will give us the initial stage. Extensive reading, particularly extensive listening, will provide that language recycling. Yeah. So there's a difference between the study reading and language reading. So the first type of reading is where we intensively study and learn the words and grammar. Extensive reading is about reading lots of easy material to build reading speed, fluency, and comprehension. So it's critically important students add this to their syllabus. So in order to do that, you're going to need different materials. For study reading, intensive reading, you're going to need these materials. Extensive reading, you use graded readers, where students choose their own books. They're focused on fluency and speed, comprehension. This will help students learn to read. This will help the students read in order to learn something. So it's critically important students do extensive reading. Extensive reading involves just reading, literally just reading. Graded readers books which are specifically written at various difficulty levels. The lowest level books have very, very easy English. The next level books have 2 or 3 sentences, present tenses only, no past tense yet. We're trying to deepen the knowledge of the present tense. Longer sentences at the next level, paragraphs, multi-part sentences, fewer pictures, more complex relative clauses, passives coming in here. And finally, we go up to text at the whole text level. If the students are doing this, they're going to be building up from, say, phonics level reading, 20, 30 books at this level. They get good at this level, they move up, 20, 30 books at this level, move up, move up, move up, move up, systematically building on previous comprehension, systematically building on previous input. And it's non-random input. They're going from the easy grammar vocabulary, becoming good at each level so that they can get better and better and better. And if they're reading a lot, graded readers average, the lower level ones, 1,500 to 5,000 words long. If they read 1 book a week, that's essentially the same as 1 textbook. Let's say your textbook has 10,000 words, 1 textbook in 1 year, 1 week, 5,000. So basically, you're going to learn a lot. So if we look at the original principles we looked at a couple of hours ago, where do they fit? Attention to form fits there. Autonomy is there. Building connections is here. So a lot of these things, the principles, are fitting in these areas. So if we really want students to build these aspects of learning, it's the meaning-focused input which is missing. We're not having enough meaning-focused input. So these are the kinds of things which we're doing maybe too much of, but we need to do much more of these types of things down here. So we need to have them reading newspapers, websites, YouTube, movies, and so on and so on and so on. However, if the texts we give them are too difficult, for example, they're listening to songs which are too difficult, they can't understand Harry Potter, they don't understand the text we're giving them, then actually they're not understanding. And what happens is, this material down here in this communication box, what actually happens, if this is too difficult, it's not meaning-focused learning, it's actually language-focused learning. So this is the part that's missing from our curriculums, and it's critically important, I think, that we have more and more people doing extensive reading. So if we have the students doing extensive reading, that is, they're reading a lot of language and they are sharing the language with other students, then they will be able to go through and learn a lot more things than they are doing at the moment. So if we have students in a typical extensive reading class, they will read something easy at their level. If they're reading something easy, they can develop fluency. They get supported, scaffolded learning. The learners are choosing what they want to. It's learner-focused input. They choose their own books. It's individualized because they're choosing their own materials. They're building autonomy. Hopefully, if the texts are interesting to them, they can react emotionally to the stories and learn about, say, other countries through their reading. They can learn to read quickly. If they're reading 80 to 100 words a minute, they're reading 4,000 to 6,000 words an hour. This will allow them to get lots of recycling, depth of learning, massive exposure, build fluency, read for meaning-focused input. And if they discuss their reading with others as through speaking and writing, we're getting skill transfer, meaning-focused output, meaningful interactions. So adding the extensive reading program will cure quite a lot of the problems we have in ELT. After reading, the students might write a report, they may have some discussions, make a presentation, for example. You may record a video of your book report, you may put it on YouTube, you could ask students to do all kinds of activities and so on. So this is what we looked at a couple of hours ago in terms of if we only do course books, these are the things that we're going to be good at, but these are the things that we're not going to be good at. If we add extensive reading, we're getting these things as well, but also all of the other parts that are not in the other one can be done at some level. We're getting skills transfer. The students are reading something they want to read about, other cultures, other places. We're enhancing comprehension, allowing them to comprehend at higher levels. Hopefully get emotional engagement, real life relevance. They can read about something, real characters, real people. It's learner focus they're choosing. They're building their autonomy. It's massive amounts of input. We're recycling the language. We're developing fluency. So adding extensive reading can help cure quite a lot of the ills we have in our curriculum at the moment. Does anybody have any comments on that? I want to spend the last sort of 10 minutes or so looking at some possible research questions. Ajahn Art has asked me to do so. Does anybody have any comments here? Please. Comments or complaints?
Okay, I've got one.
Sure.
So my question is kind of about how, because I mean, thanks so much for today. I've really enjoyed it.
Okay, thanks, Ben.
It's been
how to do extensive reading, you mean?
To go, yeah. So
Okay.
for example, we're at university. I mean, some of our courses would suit, so certainly the more generalized English courses would suit something like this. But how would I get the students to engage, for example, with, I mean, some of them would certainly benefit from graded readers at their level.
Yes.
How would I go about connecting them to the graded readers?
Okay. All right. So this is another 1 hour, 1.5 hour conversation. It's a very long answer. There's a whole lot of material that you can read and watch. I can answer the question. I absolutely can, but we'll be here another hour. The teaching of extensive reading is at one level very, very easy. Put the books in front of the students that they like and just watch them read. And that will allow them to do many of the things that are here. But you need to build a library, you need to have the right materials, you need to structure the learning, you need to have student training to make sure they know how to read and how to select books properly. How do you organize your library? Are you going to assess the comprehension of the books or not? Yes or no? How do you set up activities? If you want to find out something more about that, may I suggest, short-term solution is go to YouTube, look for the Extensive Reading Foundation channel. In there, you'll find literally dozens and dozens of videos that are like Extensive Reading 101, some of which are my videos. That some of the points I've made today will be in those videos that go a little bit more into which materials to choose, how to choose them. If you go to the Extensive Reading Foundation website, you can find guidebooks that will help you. There's quite a lot that you can learn. There is a Thailand Extensive Reading Association, which you could join. Next month, there is a Thai Extensive Reading Association meeting. There's an international conference on reading. If you go to, I think it's Chulalongkorn Thai Extensive Reading Association, go to Facebook, dig around, you can find a link to that. I will be there along with lots of other people. There's lots of places to learn. I mean, this is not a presentation about extensive reading. Absolutely, I could do that. What I would suggest you do is maybe contact me off list. Maybe Ajahn Art can pass on my email. Contact me and I'll put you in contact with.
I mean, because my thinking would be for one of my courses, maybe, you'd want to add some kind of assessment for it. So the assessment could be like an extensive, this is my book report. This
is one of the big issues. So some people say that you need to assess the extensive reading. There's a couple of problems with that. First, if you do assess it, but if we're doing extensive reading where students are choosing their own books, you then have to have a test for each individual student. And they're all going to finish at different times. So you need to have like thousands of tests available. Now, there is an online website that's called mreader.org that does already have an online test facility that allows you to do that. The other issue is that, do you actually test them? What are you actually testing them for? Now, one of the principles of extensive reading is that students should be able to read it smoothly with high comprehension already, right? If they are needing their dictionary, then it's study reading. They need to be able to read without a dictionary. They need to be able to pick up something and say, yes, I can read this without a dictionary. I mostly understand what's going on. and then I can read it, and they will build their fluency. So notice what's happening there. If they're selecting a book which is at their ability level, let's say their fluent reading level, or it's achievable for them, and they've said, yes, I can largely understand it, why do you need an extra comprehension test? It's not necessary, because the comprehension test has already been passed. What you don't know is whether they finished the book, whether they understood it, whether they liked it. If they didn't like it, they should put it down, stop, and move on. So it's not always necessary to test. Now, some schools want to, some schools don't, some kids want to, some don't. But largely, the problem with standardized testing, like tests, let's say even with MReader, is in high context, high pressure situations, some of the students are going to cheat. If you say, I want you to read one book a week, some students don't have time, they're going to ask their partner for the answers to the quiz. So the problem is that you might get quite a bit of cheating going on. So what I would suggest is, if you are going to assess comprehension, probably I wouldn't assess the comprehension of the actual book itself. What I would do is I'd set up an activity that follows the reading, skill transfer, where they write about this, maybe a summary of the book or the reaction to the book,
that's what I was thinking.
or where they would maybe give a presentation or something and assess the work that follows. Because if they've taken a test, you don't know if they got the answer from somebody else.
Yeah.
But if you ask them to do some productive activity, skill transfer, they have to do this themselves. And they have to demonstrate that they actually understood the story, maybe to their peers. So they're kind of stuck. They can't get out of it. And also, I think it's a much better assessment of whether they've actually read the story and understood it, and if so, what level. Now, it's going to depend on the level of your students, and we can get into the types of activities you can do at different levels. But do have a look at the website. That will certainly help you. At the YouTube, it will help you.
Yeah, can you remind me that is it called? It's called
the Extensive Reading Foundation YouTube.
Yeah.
Okay,
thank
or
you.
just type my name. Type my name into YouTube. People have put videos up of me. I'm not the jazz drummer. I'm the other one. There's another one.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you, Dr.
Okay.
Rob. Thanks.
Now I'm supposed to finish at 12 o'clock. I've got like 9 minutes or so. I'm more than happy to stay here all day. I could talk for 6 hours if you wanted me to. But Ajahn Art did ask me to put forward a few possible research questions. So these are some of the ones which I think still need to be researched. And the first one I think is critically important. I've said that we need graded readers or extensive reading to supplement and to add to and consolidate the working course books. But many graded reader series are not written in tandem with course books. So we really need to look at how well graded readers consolidate the language in course books. Now, I have done some initial work on this in terms of analyzing books in course books, but we do need a lot more work. What's going to happen in the future is we're going to get some automated content creation using AI. How can we get right kinds of materials created by AI that's unique for individual learners? I'll come back to talk about this in a minute. One of the teachers here, Eve, I think you know Eve, she's looking into this now. She and I had a discussion at the FLTRP conference last month in Phuket. How do we localize extensive reading materials for Thai? A lot of the graded reading materials which are out there right now are sort of have a European bias to them. So how do we localize this for Thais? And I'm currently working with a group down in Barapa University starting in October about writing extensive reading materials for Thai learners. And if you want to get involved, please get in contact. How can Thai schools build affordable extensive reading programs? I would say somewhere around 1% of Thai schools at all levels have an extensive reading program. We absolutely need to boost that. How can Thai schools build systematic vocabulary learning programs? Systematic here, but I mean like memorization of that form-meaning connection. 50, 80, 100 words a week, which is very doable from 5 minutes a day of practice. 5 minutes a day of systematic practice using word apps like Word Learner or Memrise. These apps are very good at being able to get that instant, quick, form-meaning level vocabulary. Not depth of knowledge, but that first level. So we absolutely need to build this across programs. I don't know of any institution in Thailand that has a systematic across the curriculum vocab learning programs, and it's a crucial missing piece of the puzzle. One thing we also don't know is how much language you need to be able to learn, let's say, a grammatical feature of the past tense. Again, this is critically important. You know, in the whole history of language teaching, going back 150 years, not one person has ever tried to challenge this. We know how many exposures you need to learn vocabulary or idioms or collocations. We have no idea how long it takes to learn, say, a grammatical feature. And the reason for this is it's incredibly difficult. But it's important because if you look at the structure of many course books have essentially a grammar syllabus. You know, we have the be verb, then we have present simple, then present continuous, and then the past tense, and so on, right? We have the sort of accepted pedagogical syllabus we use in ELT. But this is all predicated on the idea that we have enough input in that unit to make sure that it's learned. Now, many of the students, we all know, get to the intermediate level and they still can't use past tenses very well, not accurately, right? So even though they've met the past tense thousands of times, how much more exposure do we need? This is critically important because if we know it, say, takes 4,000, 5,000 times to learn the past tense, we need to make sure this input is in our system. And again, how much exposure do we need to get students to A1 and B2? Now, I have a few more questions that I could ask. I'm going to flash through them. These are particularly focused on vocabulary and extensive reading, which is my two specific areas. What's the optimum relationship between intensive reading and extensive reading? Notice the study reading and extensive reading are not, they're not opposites in the sense that one is better than the other. We need the study reading for the initial learning. We need the extensive reading for the depth of learning. So what's the optimum relationship? How much extensive reading and how much of intensive reading is needed? And how much reading strategy is needed, which is optimum for various levels? What's the relationship between extensive reading and motivation and confidence? We do have quite a bit of information about this. Extensive reading is well known to build overall motivation and confidence. There's hundreds of studies that do this. What's the minimum linguistic requirements for your students to read extensively? You can't read extensively from day one. How much sight vocabulary, how much sight grammar do you need to be able to start to read fluently for meaning? How much vocabulary do we learn from reading or listening to text at various difficulty rates? What's the uptake rate? So there's a few more questions here. Ben, is that somebody asking a question?
No, sorry, I left my mic on.
I'll say, okay, all right, Ben, no problem. So there's a few more questions here. As I say, I will send these slides to Art, and he will pass them on to you. I think he knows all your email addresses. So here's a few more. What non-textual features of graded readers help or hinder comprehension? How much do visual elements affect learning rates? How much reading or listening is needed to read at certain ability level? How much do you need at intermediate? How much do you need at advanced? I've already provided some data on that. What prevents or encourages comprehension in fluent reading? What are some of the speed reading bumps, in other words? What are the essential features that allow reading to be called extensive? Is just reading a graded reader extensive reading? What would a universal placement test for extensive reading look like? How can you test what somebody's level is for extensive reading? You could do localized ones for, say, Japanese learners or Thai learners, whatever. How would you do a universal one? There have been some attempts. How learners from different language groups or ability levels benefit from extensive reading. So, for example, Polish learners may learn faster than, say, Thai learners, or German learners and Dutch learners would learn faster because they have a strong relationship with English. Can all learners benefit from extensive reading? Are they independent of learning style? What's the best time to introduce extensive reading into the curriculum? Should it be elementary school, whenever? It's the best way to prepare learners for reading extensively. Do gains in extensive reading compare with those in other forms of rich input? What reading strategies can have an effect on extensive reading ability, and so on and so on. I say I'm flashing through this because I only have about 2 more minutes. Okay, here's some more, here's some more, here's some more, here's some more, here's some more. There's lots and lots and lots of them. Please go through them later. If you are doing research in extensive reading, here's a few things you do have to be careful with. Try to make sure there's no external exposure. So your students should be in your class, no outside input coming in. Make sure that if you're comparing, say, extensive reading with another approach, that they have the equal number of hours doing the other approach and your approach. Use the right test to collect the data you want, to make sure you're using the right vocab test, for example. If you make sure you pilot your tests and your questionnaires to ensure reliability. Make sure you test only on the words they've met in the reading. Don't test them on words they've not met in their reading. It's not fair to say, to give them a test on words they never met. Ensure that if you're going to compare, say, extensive reading with something else, that they both have equally rich input. Not one has rich input, the other has poor input. Also remember, you can expect faster learning for lower ability learners and slower learning for high ability learners, because at the early learning stage, you're meeting words and grammar all the time. It's very easy to pick up new language. At higher levels, it's more difficult to pick up language because you already know so much language already, you have to wait longer before you find words that you don't know. So naturally, the amount of learning the amount of time you need is going to increase exponentially. Make sure you ask the right questions in your questionnaire and do changes in behavior stay. So, you may find an instant gain, but make sure you have a delay test as well. And the reason I put these here is these are typical sort of problems that you find in the construction of extensive reading or vocabulary questions. People tend to ignore some of these things. And I put them up here just as a kind of flag for you to don't forget about these ones, because quite a lot of research misses 2 or 3 of these things, and it just makes it really, really difficult, particularly to this one where you get confounding exposure from other classes. So you can say, oh, well, they did extensive reading in my class, they did extensive reading in this class, and you report that, but you neglect to say, well, they had 7 other English classes, right? So confounding variables, you've got to be very careful of those. All right. So I am 57 seconds late. If anybody has a question or complaint, please feel free to ask. I am more than willing to stay here and answer any questions that you have or go over any of the slides. I do apologize for going so quickly. There will be a recording for you to have a look at. So go back and slow down the recording. Please, go ahead. I will actually be on campus tomorrow, and I'll be here on Saturday. I'll be here next month as well. I'm more likely to come into Thammasat. And hopefully in the next few months, I'll spend a lot more time here at Thammasat if you want to talk to me in person.
No questions.
No questions. I probably exhausted you all, sorry.
Thank you so much, Ajahn Rob, and I'm sure that everyone has learned a lot from you today about ELT, and we got some ideas for teaching and so for research. Okay. Tomorrow we have another talk by Ajahn Rob. He will be online.
Same place.
Yeah, same place. Okay. On the topic of designing your own materials. Okay, so I'm going to send you the Zoom link later today.
That will also be recorded too, I think. Is that right?
Yep, will be recorded. Okay, now I'd like to invite Assistant Professor Chatip Viriya, Vice Director for Planning and Organizational Development, to give a closing speech.
On behalf of our PhD student and our little faculty, I'd like to thank Professor Rob Waring for your insightful, informative and inspiring presentation. So we have learned that our course book is like what you found in the research finding, that 90% of the text is like some in Japan, in Korea, right? And I hope that we all know that what we are going to do to redesign our course book in the near future. So tomorrow I will attend your presentation about deciding
pressure
material, right? So once again, thank you, Professor Rob Waring, for your time and effort, right? Okay. So everyone, would you please turn on your photo so we can make group photo?
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Let me stop sharing it. Wow. Very good looking bunch.
ครับ content and just three
Ajahn Art, can you
yes
hi I can see some of you here. Hi Montana, how are you?
1 2 3 can you do it again please 1 2 3 Okay, thank you so much. Hope to see you tomorrow.
Just before you go, I just want to say thank you very much for your time. I'm going to, if I can't seem to find a way to message everybody. I don't have access to messaging everybody in the chat. Anyway, please ask Ajahn Up for my email address. I will be here if anybody wants to sit and have a cup of tea with me sometime and chat about your materials, go over stuff. It's a very dense talk today. I can go over many of the points much more deeply in person. If you want to know a bit more about writing materials or setting up an extensive reading program, I do hope that Thammasat sets up some extensive reading programs for your students. It's critically important for their language learning. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you ครับ บ๊ายบายครับ
Tomorrow morning or afternoon
afternoon ครับ 1 o'clock ครับ
1 o'clock, yeah.
ครับ afternoon นะครับ
Thank you ค่ะ
Okay, take care.
ครับ
Bye-bye everybody.
Bye
Bye.